Welcome to Lead Well, Live Whole. I'm your host, Michael Sirmon. Every episode, we'll spend a few minutes exploring the challenges, questions, and realities of everyday life, because success means little if you lose yourself in the process. So take a breath, settle in, and let's spend a few minutes exploring life together. Welcome back to the Lead Well, Live Whole podcast. I'm Michael Sirmon. If you've been with me for the past several episodes, we've been taking a journey inward. We've talked about feeling lost. We've talked about overthinking. We've talked about identity. And we've talked about why we're often harder on ourselves than anyone else. And in the last episode, we explored what secure leadership actually looks like. But today I want to zoom out, because the more years I've spent leading, the more convinced I've become that almost everything we've been taught about leadership is backwards. The world says that louder is stronger, but experience says that quieter often is. The world rewards certainty, but life rewards curiosity. The world celebrates being first, but history remembers those who served. So leadership is full of paradoxes. That's truths that appear contradictory. And until you've lived long enough really to discover that they're both true. And understanding these paradoxes may be one of the greatest competitive advantages any leader can possess. But what is a paradox, right? A paradox isn't a contradiction. It's two truths that appear to oppose each other, yet somehow they coexist, right? And leadership is full of them. In fact, I'd argue the best leaders spend their lives learning to hold two seemingly opposite ideas in balance, not choosing one over the other, but holding both. Because leadership isn't black and white, it's tension. The first paradox I want to talk about is that, the strongest leaders are often the gentlest. We've somehow confused aggression with strength, but you know what? They're not the same. Anyone can raise their voice. Anyone can intimidate. Anyone can dominate. But it takes remarkable strength to remain calm when everyone else is losing their minds, to answer anger with composure, to correct someone without humiliating them, to stand firm without becoming harsh. Gentleness isn't weakness. Gentleness is actually strength under control. The second paradox is that the most confident leaders admit what they don't know. Insecure leaders pretend they know everything, but secure leaders ask questions. They seek advice. They change their minds, right? They don't fear looking uninformed, because their confidence doesn't come from always being right. It comes from knowing they can learn. And ironically, the smartest person in the room usually asks the most questions. The third paradox is that the people with the most authority rarely remind you they have it. Have you ever noticed that? People constantly demanding respect usually haven't earned it. The leaders everyone naturally respects rarely have to announce their title. In fact, I know a lot of them that don't have a title. Real authority doesn't need volume, because their character speaks loudly enough. The fourth paradox, the busiest leaders intentionally create margin. Our culture celebrates exhaustion. We celebrate people who say, I'm slammed, I've got 70 meetings this week, or I've barely slept. Somehow we've turned burnout into a badge of honor. But the leaders making the best decisions usually have breathing room. Usually understand that margin creates perspective, that perspective creates wisdom, and wisdom prevents mistakes. Being busy isn't evidence of importance. Sometimes it's evidence that you've stopped leading intentionally. The fifth paradox. The leaders who accomplish the most often do the least themselves. I know that sounds ridiculous until you understand leadership. Leadership is creating an environment where others can. Every task you refuse to delegate becomes a ceiling. Every task you refuse to delegate robs someone else of learning, robs someone else of the confidence to do their job, undermines who the people are around you. So healthy leaders build people, not dependence. The sixth paradox: the people who influence the most talk about themselves the least. We've entered an age of personal branding, followers, algorithms, visibility, and none of those are inherently wrong. But influence doesn't change or doesn't begin with speaking. It begins with listening. People don't remember how often you talked. They remember how deeply they felt heard. I was at an event in West Texas, and Tammy and I had the opportunity to have dinner with Terry Crews after a speaking event. And as we're talking with him, our small group was chatting with him, we started talking about the challenges. We're talking about the things that, in his life in particular. And he said one of the biggest challenges for him was having to understand or come to understand that it wasn't about the Terry Crews brand. It was about the team. It was about the mission. It was about not him, right? It wasn't a me mentality. And I think a lot of us in leadership roles, and again, in business or at home or church or wherever, right, we really have to get beyond this is about me. My very first official supervisory role after the military, my best friend worked there, and I went to him at a certain point and I said, "How am I doing?" And he said, "Honestly, you're doing great, but you're taking yourself too seriously," right? It became about me. I couldn't make a mistake. I couldn't do it wrong. So I would work harder and push more with more intensity in areas that I really didn't need to, right? Because unintentionally, I was creating an environment where the people around me on my team didn't feel heard. They came to learn that if they just stood back a little bit, that I would push in and get it done. Well, that one conversation was enough to open my eyes. I was able to pull back. I was able to find balance in how I was approaching the leadership required for this role and get the entire team engaged. So the seventh paradox is that leaders who change organizations first change themselves, right? It's tempting to believe if everyone else would just improve, ... whatever that means. But culture rarely rises above the leader. As goes the head, so goes the body, right? Organizations become mirrors of the leader. If the organization is filled with a lot of backbiting and fighting and jockeying for position and the insecurity that comes from all of that, you don't have to do any more than look up to the leader, because that's the type of leadership that they are bringing to the table, right? The conversations you avoid, your team avoids. The ownership you model, they model. The humility you demonstrate becomes permission for everyone else. So leadership starts in the mirror. Always has, always will. Paradox 8. The leaders who appear fearless simply move despite fear, right? Fear never completely disappears. It doesn't for me. It probably doesn't for you. The difference isn't the absence of fear, but it's refusing to let fear become the decision maker. Courage isn't certainty. It's obedience despite uncertainty. There's some modern leadership dilemmas we want to talk about, right? So let's widen the lens a little bit, because these paradoxes create tensions every leader must learn to navigate, right? Confidence versus humility. You need confidence. People want to follow conviction, but confidence without humility becomes arrogance. Humility without confidence becomes hesitation, right? And great leaders somehow embody both. They know who they are without believing they're better than anyone else. Results versus relationships. Organizations need results, right? There's no lie about that. Families need results. Businesses need results. But results that are purchased at the expense of people are temporary. Healthy relationships often produce better long-term results than relentless pressure ever could. right? So the best leaders never choose between people and performance. They recognize that people create performance. Remember, we are first in the people business. Speed versus wisdom. Everything around us says go faster, respond faster, grow faster, scale faster, decide faster. And, sometimes speed wins, but sometimes slowing down saves years of recovery. The question isn't how quickly can I decide, it's how clearly can I think. Influence versus control. Control demands compliance. Influence inspires commitment. Control works while you're present. Influence works after you've left the room. One manages behavior, the other changes hearts. I'll let you guess which one lasts. Vision versus execution. Vision is exciting. Execution is repetitive. Vision fills conference rooms. Execution fills calendars. One without the other eventually collapses. Great leaders dream and then do the ordinary work required to make the dreams real. Strength versus compassion, right? There are moments to stand firm, but there are also moments to extend grace. Wisdom is knowing which moment you're in. People don't need leaders who are always soft, nor do they need leaders who are always hard. They need leaders who genuinely care enough to know the difference and are consistent. How about ambition and contentment, right? This one may surprise you. Healthy ambition is not the enemy. In fact, healthy ambition drives innovation. It drives growth. It drives improvement. But ambition detached from contentment becomes endless striving. There's always another promotion, always another milestone, always another achievement, always another mountain. So if your peace always lives on to the next summit, you're never going to enjoy the climb. Achievement versus identity. I really struggled with this one when I was younger. I guess I still do in some ways. But I think this is the biggest paradox of all, because achievement matters. Achievement creates opportunities. It solves problems. It serves people. But it should never become your identity, because one day, every title will end. Every office will belong to somebody else, and every accomplishment will fade into history. So if you're your achievements, you'll lose yourself every time success changes, right? Healthy leaders know exactly who they are before they ever step into the boardroom, before they ever step onto the floor, before they ever step in front of their teams. And as I've grown older, I've noticed something, that the leaders that I admire most aren't necessarily the smartest. They aren't always the most charismatic. They don't dominate every room. They're simply healthy, right? They know when to speak. They know when to listen. They know when to push. They know when to rest. They know when to lead. They know when to follow. They've learned to live inside the paradox. And I think that's why people trust them. Not because they're perfect, but because they're whole. The world keeps telling us leadership is about becoming bigger. It's about bigger platforms, bigger titles, bigger influence, bigger accomplishments. But I've come to believe that leadership is actually about becoming healthier, because healthy leaders build healthy families, healthy teams, healthy organizations, healthy churches, and healthy communities. And perhaps most importantly, they leave behind healthy people. So this week, I want to leave you with a question. Which leadership paradox do you resist the most? Is it slowing down when everything says hurry? Is it admitting that you don't know something? Is it choosing relationships over recognition? Or is it letting go of control? Maybe it's realizing that who you are matters far more than what you've accomplished. I would encourage you to spend some time with that this week. You may discover that your greatest breakthrough isn't found in learning another leadership technique. It may come from embracing a truth that feels completely backwards. So thank you for spending this time with me today. And if this episode encouraged you or challenged you, I would be grateful if you'd follow the podcast, leave a review, and share it with someone who's leading at work, at home, or in their community. These simple actions help more people discover these conversations and allow us to continue building a community of leaders who are committed to thinking clearly, leading confidently, and living whole. You can also find more leadership resources, articles, coaching opportunities, and information about my books at michaelsirmon.com. So until next time, lead well, live whole. If today's conversation raised a question you've been wrestling with, I'd love to help. I offer one-on-one coaching for individuals navigating pressure, transition, and important decisions. You can learn more at michaelsirmon.com.